Hello and welcome to the next installment of What's for Dinner. We're using all the ingredients you see on the screen right now. I'm going to show you how to make my take on a Middle Eastern inspired spicy lamb curry. So first thing first, we're going to go ahead and toast our dry spices. Now if you're curious about what's in this bowl, go ahead and head down to the link in the description. It'll take you to the Fire and Steel website where you'll find step-by-step instructions and a full list of ingredients of everything used to cook this recipe today. So take a small skillet, place it over medium heat, and we're going to go ahead and add in the spices. Make sure you don't walk away from this for too very long because the spices will burn, and when they start to burn, they go very quickly. So while the spices toast, we're going to go ahead and get some water ready because we are going to blanch some of the vegetables in this, specifically the carrots and the cauliflower. So go ahead and get that water over high heat. We want to get it to a nice rolling boil. And here, if you're not very masterful at tossing things in a skillet, you don't have to toss it. You can swirl them, stir them. The idea is you just want to keep them moving so they do not burn. So while the water comes to a boil and the spices toast, we'll go ahead and start processing some of our vegetables. As I said earlier, we're going to use some cauliflower in this dish just to add some vegetation and give it some bulk. So here the spices are just about done. We're going to go ahead and get them out of the pan and then into this little mortar and pestle. If you don't have a mortar and pestle, you can skip this step. It's not necessary, but just grinding the spices very lightly does help release even more flavor into the stew. So for the cauliflower, we want to break this down into bite-sized pieces. It should be big enough that you can fit it on a fork, but you don't want to cut it too small because it may break apart in the final dish. Next up is the onions. We're going to go ahead and cut the onions into fairly large pieces. We want a nice large dice on this, specifically because we don't want the onions to get lost inside the stew. We want them, even after the long cooking process, to still be something you can find, pick out, and taste individually. Next up is the carrots. We're going to go ahead and trim off the ends, both the tips and the root ends. Not the root ends, the stem ends. And then we're going to go ahead and coin cut these into about 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch pieces. We want them just to be just about bite size, but big enough to add some heft and some bulk to the dish. Next up is going to be our aromatics. Here I'm using jalapenos. I'm using 2 of them because I wanted this to be fairly spicy. If you're not a big fan of spicy like that, you can cut down to 1. If you really like spicy, you can add more or even substitute out the peppers for something else like a habanero. I like jalapenos because you can add a decent amount of them and they do bring a nice flavor. Not that habaneros don't, but you can add enough to really impact the flavor of a dish like this. Next up, we're going to use a little bit of ginger. Now, I'm not adding too much because this isn't meant to be a kind of Indian or Southeast Asian curry. I want this to be much more of a Middle Eastern inspired dish, but the ginger will play well with all the flavors in here, so this is just a little bit to kind of play backup. Same with the garlic. This actually isn't that much garlic, considering most dishes like this would use a lot more, but I don't want garlic to be the main flavor here. I want the spices, specifically the Ras El Hanout and the other whole spices, to really play the main role in what this dish tastes like. And here I'm just kind of rough chopping everything. Now that the water's come to a nice rolling boil, we're going to go ahead and get in our carrots first, and then after the carrots have cooked for maybe about 5 minutes, we'll go ahead and add in the cauliflower next. This way we can kind of blanch everything all in one pot. For the cauliflower, you're going to blanch it until it's just tender. It doesn't take very long, maybe 2 or 3 minutes. While the vegetables do blanch, however, we're going to go ahead and get our meat ready. So take the lamb meat, add a little cooking oil, a little salt and pepper, and then about 2 tablespoons of that Ras El Hanout seasoning. I usually don't like to use spice blends in my recipes because I don't want it to be something you can't find, but this is becoming pretty commonplace, and even if you can't find it at your grocery store, if you check the Fire and Steel website, there will be a link in the recipe where you can purchase it on Amazon. So with the vegetables nice and blanched, we'll go ahead and drain them off and then give them a quick rinse with cold water. It's not necessary to fully shock these in ice water. I just want to slow down and pretty much stop the cooking process. But again, ice water is not really necessary. Now with the pot empty and brought back over high heat, we're going to begin the process of searing off the lamb chunks. Now you can see I'm leaving about maybe 1/2 inch to 1/4 inch in between those pieces. That's important. If you don't leave that space, the meat will stew, not sear. You want to have enough space that any moisture that comes out has the ability to evaporate off. After about 5 minutes, go ahead and begin checking the pieces. Some of them will get a nice brown color like that one. Go ahead and flip them over. You want to sear them on all the large flat sides that you can. I can't really overstate how important a good searing process is to a stew like this, mostly because this flavor can't be replaced. There's nothing you can add to the dish that's going to add the flavor of seared meat. So this takes kind of a long time, and it's probably the most labor-intensive step, but it is really important. So while the lamb is searing, I'm going to go ahead and get my spice mix of the ground spices put together. This way it just can be dumped right in. So that's Ras El Hanout. This is a little bit of turmeric, which actually has more of a flavor than people think. I was going to add some coriander, but there's lots of coriander seed in the whole spices that I toasted earlier. And then this is going to be some smoked paprika. The idea here is that the smoked paprika will add in a kind of grilled meat flavor. If you had the ability and I had the time to grill the lamb instead of sear it in the pot, that would be even better. But in lieu of that, I'm going to go ahead and add in the smoked paprika. And then finally, those were some whole cumin seeds. You could use dried cumin. I prefer the whole seeds, and I didn't toast them because I didn't want the cumin flavor to become too intense and overpower everything else. So here you can see some of the pieces of lamb are finished searing, the smaller pieces specifically, and as those pieces finish, I'm moving them off to the side using this cutting board. You could use a plate or a bowl, and then moving the other pieces that are still searing down to the bottom so that I can introduce a whole nother round. This is just for the sake of time and getting this all seared off pretty quickly. And again, make sure you space the meat out. Give it, again, about 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch. That way it does sear well. And by letting those juices evaporate, not only do you allow the meat to sear very well, what you're doing is you're creating this really nice, flavorful base in the bottom of the pan. It's what the French would call fond or foundation, and it's going to add a lot of flavor to the pot as well. So here we're working on this. Took me about 3 batches to get all the lamb meat seared off. We're finally finished. Here the lamb is almost finished searing, and I went ahead and I added in a little bit of butter. I'm going to add it after the fact, but you could go ahead and add in a little bit of cooking oil as well. And again, if you're looking for specific amounts, please see the recipe in the description. So we're going to go ahead and swirl in the butter and then start adding in all the spices. Those are the ground toasted whole spices, and then I'm going to quickly follow up with the pre-ground spices that I put together a little bit earlier. So once you add in these ground spices, you're going to notice the pan dries out very quickly. This is fine. What we're trying to create is a spice paste, and then we do want to toast this again. Now, the whole spices were already toasted, but the dry spices were not. And the secret to making a good curry and stew like this is to let the spices cook on their own for just a little bit. It opens up the flavor, it gets some of the volatile and essential oils moving around, and it really just increases the intensity of taste that you're going to get out of your final product. So with the spices cooked off for just a little bit, again, be careful because the spices will burn very quickly. We're going to go ahead and add in the aromatics. This is our jalapeno, ginger, and garlic. Now stir this around. Pretty much don't stop stirring this the entire time because there is a very real chance those spices will burn. You've added something else to the pan, but not enough to really absorb all that heat. Not yet. After about 2 minutes of cooking, go ahead and add in your onions, and the same thing. Begin to stir very vigorously, very quickly. Again, we don't want the spices to burn. We want them to impart lots of good flavor. So once the onions have been cooking for about 5 minutes and they begin to get soft and translucent, we're going to go ahead and hit this pot with a little bit of salt. That's just to loosen up and start getting more of the moisture coming out of the onions. At the same time, we're going to go ahead and add in the tomato paste. This is going to just add kind of a rich, it's going to really play well with the meaty flavor of the lamb. It's going to add a little bit of acidity and just kind of add a nice rich background flavor that'll really tie everything together. Next up, along with all that, we're going to go ahead and add in the cilantro stems. And just keep mixing all this through and cook it for about 2 more minutes. Once you start to see a bit of a gravy form, go ahead and add back in the lamb with any of the juices that may have come out while it was sitting. Go ahead, get this stirred all the way through, get it nice, incorporated, and very well homogenized, and then we're going to park it over low heat and cook for 30 minutes. After 30 minutes, you can see the pan is starting to dry out just a little bit. It's not burnt, which is good, but we do want to add some moisture back in because that lamb is very far from done. You can see there I'm giving one of the pieces a poke, and it's still tough as could be. So we're going to add in about 1 cup of hot water. This is just to buy us some time before the pan dries out so that the lamb has enough time to get cooked all the way through. Go ahead, stir the water through, and then we're going to park this back over low heat for 30 more minutes. But first, we're going to make sure we check the seasoning. I almost skipped a step. So give it a quick taste. It's going to be very spicy at this point, and it's going to need some salt. I'm using beef base as a salt substitute because it's going to add in even more flavor. Add in maybe 2 teaspoons to begin with, and then after that, if you want to add in more, you can. I usually use a decent amount of salt in my food, but if you're trying to keep your sodium low or just don't like a lot of salt, you don't have to add in more beef base if you don't want to. So lid back on, 30 more minutes. You can see here I actually moved it to the back burner, which is even lower because again, I don't want this pot to dry out. Here you can see the texture is actually really nice. It's not lost as much moisture as it did during the first cooking process. The meat is still a little bit tough, but it's getting there. I'm going to go ahead and do another seasoning check. And for me, this needed a little bit more seasoning because I'm kind of hemming and hawing a little bit. It's very close, but I wanted just a little bit more salinity in the dish. So I added in just a little bit more of the beef base. You could use salt as well, but again, the beef base it does the same job as salt while also providing more flavor, which more flavor is almost always a good thing. So we'll go ahead and get that stirred through, lid back on, and then cook for 30 more minutes or until the meat is tender. At this point, the stew's basically done. We're just waiting for the meat to be tender. And one note on the seasoning on this final pass is you do want to make sure it should be a little bit salty. The stew in this form, it should be almost too salty. It should be a little bit unpleasant to eat because of that. The reason being is that these vegetables, along with the green beans I'm getting ready to add, are not salted. So they are going to take some of the salt from this dish and they're going to mellow it all out. So by having the stew without the vegetables a little bit salty, the final product will be spot on for seasoning. So here I just stirred in the cauliflower and the carrots. I let it cook for just a few minutes just to kind of help everything kind of homogenize. And then I'm going to go ahead and add in the green beans. So a few minutes have gone by, and now the green beans go in. You want to add the green beans right before serving, just because being a green vegetable, they will overcook very, very quickly. And these were just steam and bag green beans, make it nice and easy. So dump them in right before service, give it a quick mix, let it cook for just a couple more minutes, and then you are good to go and ready to serve. So I served this with some flatbread. This was not intended to be served with rice. This is why it's such a thick, dry curry. I served it with naan bread. You could serve it with whatever you like. As always, I thank you for watching. Please like, favorite, comment, share, and subscribe. I've got some new things coming in 2020. We're going to be doing some healthy recipes for the new year. I've also got a few Christmas episodes coming up for just little things you could serve with, not necessarily for Christmas dinner, but along with Christmas dinner. I thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.